The Crimson Mask. The small village of Haifa had always been shrouded in mystery and whispers of the supernatural. At its heart stood an ancient, abandoned mansion, decaying with time yet holding an eerie allure. The locals called it the Crimson Mask Manor, for rumors claimed that at night, a figure clad in a crimson mask could be seen peering from its upper windows. Emily, a young investigative journalist, had always been drawn to the unknown. Accompanied by her friends, Jack, Sophia, and Mark, she arrived in Haifa with the intent of uncovering the secrets of the manor for a documentary. "Look at that place," Jack said, pointing towards the manor as they stood at a distance. "It's terrifying," Sophia murmured, her voice tinged with unease. Mark, ever the confident one, smirked. Terrifying or not, we're going in. When they asked the villagers about the manor, they received odd glances and hushed warnings. An old man named Joseph, one of the oldest in the village, spoke in a trembling voice. "That manor is cursed. Those who enter never return, or if they do, they're not the same." "Have you ever seen the figure in the crimson mask?" Emily pressed. Joseph shuddered visibly. "It's not a figure. It's vengeance personified." Despite the dire warning, Emily and her friends did not take the stories seriously and entered the foreboding mansion. At the manor gates, they felt a very foreboding atmosphere emanating from it. The rusted iron gate was engraved with some strange symbols, as if left by some forgotten ancient civilization. "Do you have any idea what these symbols might mean?" Jack asked, while examining the gate carefully. "Something old and unsettling," Mark guessed, running his hand over the carvings. Pushing open the gate with a loud creak, they were greeted by a gust of icy wind. The air inside was thick with the smell of decay, rotting wood and damp earth. As they entered the dark manor hallways, they saw that the walls were covered with intricate patterns and writings in a language none of them could understand. "This place feels like it's straight out of a horror story," Emily whispered. In one of the rooms, Sophia found a tattered crimson mask, its edges stained with what seemed to be dried blood. "Is this the notorious Red Mask?" she asked, her voice quivering. "It fits the villagers' accounts," Mark said, studying it closely. Just then, the faint sound of footsteps echoed through the hall. "What was that?" Jack asked, turning around. "Is someone else here?" Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. They shone their flashlights into the shadows but found nothing. Yet Sophia felt an inexplicable presence lingering just behind them. As night advanced, the group could feel the mansion tighten its sinister grip on them. The patterns seemed to writhe and shift before their eyes in the faint light. Emily swore that she could hear whispers, though she couldn't identify who was whispering. "This place is alive," Jack muttered uneasily. "We must leave," Sophia said, her voice quivering. "Not now," Emily said firmly. "We are so close to discovering something extraordinary." In the last room they visited, they found a chest with the same markings on it as on the gate. In this chest, they found a book smeared with blood and another red mask. "This book might hold all the answers," Emily said, brushing the dust off its cover. As soon as Mark touched the book, an unearthly howl filled the air, and the mansion's doors slammed shut on their own. "This place doesn't want us to leave," Sophia said, her face pale with fear. The group huddled together as the temperature in the room plummeted. The walls vibrated with an unseen force, and the once silent mansion roared to life with an eerie symphony of creaks and whispers. "This isn't just a house," Emily said, her voice shaking. "It's something much darker." "We had done a terrible thing to come here," Mark whispered, pressing his hand around the book so tightly that his bicep bulged. There was a red illumination on the floor, originating from the mask, making it look like it belonged among the living. Night had fallen deep, and there was a strange sense in the old house of pulsing, living power that was neither quite dead nor quite alive. In this room of darkness, the girls stood bunched, their breathing misty in the freezing air, and glowing in its corner of the room like an uprearing crimson claw, seemed to rise and swell to the heat, the red mask. What is this place? Sophia whispered, clutching her arms together as if to protect herself against an unseen presence. This is more than just a house, Emily murmured. Her eyes remained fixed upon the glowing mask. This place holds secrets, terrible secrets. Jack paced nervously, shaking the beam of his flashlight with each step. We should have listened to the villagers. This isn't just some spooky old house, it's alive. Mark, ever the skeptic, crouched near the book they had found. Its cover was rough and stained, with strange symbols etched into its surface. If this book holds the answers, then we need to figure out what it says. Are you crazy? Sophia snapped. Whatever's in that book caused all of this. It's the only way, Emily said, her voice steady but tinged with unease. We can't leave until we know the truth. Emily carefully opened the book, the brittle pages crackling under her fingers. The writing inside was unlike anything they had seen, symbols and patterns that seemed to shift and shimmer as if alive. What language is this? Jack asked, peering over her shoulder. It's not any language I recognize, Emily said, tracing her fingers over the text. But it feels familiar. Sophia stepped away from the book, casting a look at the door. We should go. Now this place is cursed and we already went too far. However, just as she finished speaking, the door they came in creaked shut with a finality that echoed ominously. Leaving doesn't seem like an option anymore, Mark said grimly. Suddenly, a soft whisper filled the room, a sound so quiet it was almost inaudible. But it wasn't just a whisper. It was a chorus, voices overlapping, speaking in a language none of them understood. Do you hear that? Sophia asked, her voice trembling. Emily nodded, her eyes wide. It's coming from the walls. Jack flashed his light on the peeling wallpaper, and for a moment, it seemed that the patterns writhed, forming grotesque faces that mouthed silent words. This isn't real, Mark said, shaking his head. It's just our imagination. Is it? Emily asked sharply. Then why does it feel like they're watching us? As they debated their next move, a low, metallic groan echoed through the room. It came from beneath them, a sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor below. There's a basement, Emily said. No way, Jack protested. We're not going down there. We have to, Emily insisted. If there are answers, they'll be there. Reluctantly, the group followed her out of the room and down the hallway. The air felt colder with each step, the whispers louder, as if guiding them. At the end of the hall, they found a narrow staircase going down into darkness. On the door at the top was a rusted chain, as if someone, or something, had forced its way through the door. This is a bad idea, Sophia whispered, but she followed anyway. The stairs groaned under their weight as they made their way down, the beams of their flashlights cutting through the heavy darkness. The basement was full of the smell of damp earth and rot, and the air was thick and oppressive. As they finally hit the bottom, their lights exposed an immense underground chamber. The walls were all lined with shelves filled with strange artifacts, jars filled with murky liquids, ancient tools, and more of the strange symbols carved into the wood. In the center of the room, on an altar, its surface stained dark with something that looked disturbingly like blood. What the hell is this place? Jack whispered. Emily moved forward, her flashlight highlighting carvings etched into the surface of the altar. This is a place of rituals, she said. Someone or something used this room for dark purposes. Suddenly, the whispers stopped and fell silent. Then, out of the shadows, came the crimson glow that Emily remembered. The mask, Sophia whispered. It hovered in midair, spinning slowly as if suspended by some invisible force. "Don't touch it," Mark said, stepping back. But Emily couldn't look away. "It's calling to us," she said, her voice distant. "No," Jack snapped, grabbing her arm. "We're leaving, now." But before they could move, the glow from the mask exploded, filling the room with blinding light. When the light faded, they were no longer alone. Figures had emerged from the shadows, tall humanoid shapes with featureless faces and long, claw-like fingers. "They're not real," Mark said, backing away. "They can't be real." But when one of the figures lunged at him, slashing his arm, he screamed in pain. "Run!" Emily shouted, pulling him back. The group sprinted up the stairs, the figures close behind. As they reached the main floor, the door to the basement slammed shut, trapping the creatures below. Breathless and dazed, they reconvened in the grand hall. Mark clutched his wounded arm, his face pale. "They won't let us out," Sophia said, her voice quivering. Emily looked around, her mind racing. "The book, it holds answers. We need to find a way to read it." "How?" Jack asked. "We can't even read the language." "There has to be a key," Emily said. "Something in this house that can help us." The group decided to split up and search the manor for clues. Emily and Jack went upstairs, while Sophia and Mark stayed on the main floor. But as they moved through the house, it became clear that the mansion was not just a setting. It was an active participant in their torment. Doors slammed shut on their own, hallways stretched endlessly, and the whispers began again, louder and more insistent. "It's like the house doesn't want us to find anything," Emily said, her voice tight. "Or it's trying to drive us insane," Jack replied. Upstairs, Emily found a small, locked box hidden in a dusty wardrobe. Its surface was covered in the same symbols as the book. "Jack, help me open this," she called. As he pried it open with a crowbar, the box gave off a low hum, and inside they found a fragment of parchment with translated text. "It's a ritual," Emily said, scanning the fragment. "A way to banish the spirits tied to this place." Downstairs, Sophia and Mark find the painting of the woman with the red mask. Her eyes seem to be following them, and when they turn to stare, the woman in the painting starts to move. "Mark, we need to go," Sophia says, stepping backward. The manor seemed to have come alive. The walls tightened, whispers increased with every passing moment, and the air was weighed upon by the presence anciently evil, yet anciently so. The group huddled in the library, pale faces and uneven breaths filling the air. A small piece of parchment Emily had discovered lay on the table before them, the translated text a glimmer of hope in the suffocating darkness. "We have a ritual," Emily started, her voice steady despite the grip of fear on her chest. "But it's incomplete. We need the rest of the book to put it all together." Jack nodded, though his hands shook as he held the flashlight. "And while we're looking for it, what's stopping them? They're not just in the basement anymore," Sophia whispered. "They're everywhere." Mark, his arm bandaged but still bleeding slightly, stared into the flickering flames of the fireplace. "This place isn't just haunted. It's alive. It knows we're here, and it won't let us go." The lights in the library dimmed suddenly, and the flames in the fireplace flickered wildly before being snuffed out entirely. Darkness swallowed the room, and with it came the whispers, no longer faint but loud, insistent, and filled with malice. "Get the light back," Sophia cried, her voice breaking. Jack fumbled with the flashlight, but when he clicked it on, the beam revealed a figure standing at the edge of the room, a shadowy shape, tall and faceless, its presence radiating a suffocating terror. "Run!" Emily screamed, grabbing the parchment and shoving it into her pocket. They tore out of the library with a heavy shadow behind them. When they ran down the corridor, their doors slammed shut all around them, and the floor would lurch and jounce, pitching them against one another. "This isn't possible," Jack bellowed in the general madness of it all. "It's the house," Emily returned. "It's trying to trap us." In their desperate flight, they found a hidden door at the end of the corridor. Emily pushed open the door. They found a very narrow staircase winding down. "We have no choice," she shouted. "It's either this or them." They did not hesitate as they descended into the unknown, the heavy footsteps of the shadow echoing behind them. The air grew colder as they went deeper, and the walls of the staircase seemed to weep, dark streaks of moisture running down their surfaces. At the bottom, they found themselves in a cavernous chamber, the ceiling lost in darkness. Strange symbols carved on the stone walls, and at the center of the room stood a pedestal. Resting on it lay another piece of the book. "That's it," Emily said, moving toward it. "Wait." Mark grabbed her arm, his face pale. "It's too easy. This place, it's a trap." But as he spoke, the shadows from the staircase began to spill into the room, twisting and coalescing into more of the faceless figures. "We don't have time," Emily snapped. "Cover me." As Emily reached for the book fragment, the shadows attacked. Jack swung his flashlight like a weapon, the beam momentarily scattering the figures, but they reformed almost instantly. Sophia screamed as one of the creatures lunged at her, its claw-like hand tearing her jacket. Mark grabbed a broken piece of wood from the floor and swung wildly, his eyes wide with terror. Emily's fingers closed around the fragment, and as she pulled it from the pedestal, the room shook violently. A deafening roar filled the air, and the shadows recoiled as if in pain. "What did you do?" Jack yelled. "I don't know," Emily answered, clutching the piece to her chest. "But we have to get out of here." As they ran back up the stairs, the earth started breaking apart and splitting apart beneath them. A deep red glow crept through the fissures, and the whispers began screaming. "The house is falling apart!" Sophia cried. "No," Emily said, her voice grim. "It's not falling apart, it's waking up!" The group burst into the hallway, only to find it transformed. The walls pulsed as if alive, and the ceiling dripped with a thick black liquid. The air was filled with the stench of decay, and the once familiar layout of the house was now a twisted maze. "We're running out of time," Emily said, glancing at the fragment. "The ritual. It's the only way to stop this." As they navigated the shifting hallways, the mask appeared again, floating in the air ahead of them. This time, it was not alone. The woman from the painting stood beneath it, her face obscured by the mask, her body wrapped in tattered red robes. "You cannot stop it," she said, her voice a chilling echo. "This place is not yours to escape." "Who are you?" Emily demanded, her voice shaking. "I am the keeper," the woman replied, "and you are trespassers." As she raised her hand, the walls began to close in, the hallway shrinking around them. "Move!" Jack shouted, pulling Emily away as the walls nearly crushed them. Desperate for survival, Emily reached into her pocket and raised the shard aloft. Symbols upon its face flickered with an eerie glow, and the walls slowed their attack. The keeper stumbled backward, her masked face angling to one side in apparent disarray. "You can't wield that," she spat. "Watch me," Emily replied, her hands shaking. It was emitting a blinding light, and for an instant, the hallway was quiet. Then the mask went brighter, and the keeper laughed, a hollow, chilling sound. "You think you can halt what has already been set in motion?" she said. "The house has chosen you. There is no way out." Using the fragment's power, the group was able to thrust back the shadows and escape into another room. This one was filled with mirrors, their surfaces warped and cracked. "What now?" Sophia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Emily looked at the fragment and the parchment, thinking. "We need the rest of the book. Without it, we can't finish the ritual." "But where do we find it?" Mark asked. She looked around, her eyes making a circle with the large mirror in the room. It was fluid, shimmering as if it were liquid. "I think," she said slowly, We have to go through. The room held its breath. Warped mirrors reflected grotesque versions of Emily, Mark, Sophia, and Jack. Twisted, distorted, faces stretched into ghastly shapes, eyes sunken and hollow. The largest mirror was at the center, shimmering with a liquid surface, rippling as if inviting them inside. "What is this?" Sophia whispered, clutching Jack's arm. Her voice trembled, her wide eyes fixed on the shifting mirror. "It's not just a mirror," Emily said, her voice steady but laced with unease. "It's a doorway." "A doorway to where?" Mark asked, his voice a mix of curiosity and dread. Emily looked down at the fragment of the book in her hand. The symbols on its surface faintly glowed, resonating with the ripples in the mirror. "Wherever the rest of this book is, or whatever is waiting for us." Jack stepped forward, flashlight in hand. "Do we have a choice? If we stay here, we'll die." Sophia shook her head. "We don't know what's on the other side. And we know what's here," Jack shot back. "Shadows, whispers, and death." Emily approached the mirror, her distorted image reflected back at her. She breathed deeply and turned to the group. "If we don't pass through, we'll never leave this house. We'll never be able to stop her." Without waiting for an answer, she reached out and touched the mirror. The surface rippled like water, and then, with a sudden pull, it swallowed her whole. The others shouted her name, but Emily was gone. The mirror rippled violently before settling again, now reflecting only their horrified faces. "We have to follow her," Mark said, stepping toward the mirror. Sophia grabbed his arm. "Are you insane? What if it's a trap?" "And if it is," Mark retorted, "do you want to stay here and wait for those things to find us?" Before Sophia could argue, Jack stepped through the mirror, vanishing just as Emily had. Mark didn't hesitate, plunging in after him. Sophia stood alone for a moment, the shadows creeping closer from the corners of the room. A whisper brushed against her ear, soft but menacing. "You cannot escape." With a scream, she threw herself into the mirror. The other side was not what they expected. The group dropped into a barren landscape, illuminated by deep red light. Across the sky, dark, ominous clouds swirled. The ground that met their feet was cracked and dry, and it glowed faintly with the same color of crimson that the mask had. In the distance loomed jagged towers, their surfaces covered in some of the same strange symbols they had seen in the basement and in the cavern. The air hung heavy and oppressive, heavy with a low hum that vibrated through their very bones. "What is this place?" Sophia whispered, her voice hardly audible. Emily gripped the book fragment tightly, her eyes scanning the horizon. "It's the heart of the curse," she said. "This is where it all began." "And where it will end," a voice echoed. The group turned to see the woman in the crimson mask standing atop a nearby ridge. Her tattered robes billowed in an unseen wind, and the mask glowed faintly in the dim light. "You shouldn't have come here," she said, her voice haunting and commanding. "We had no choice," Emily replied, moving forward. "We are going to stop this, no matter what it takes." The woman cocked her head, as if finding the humor in it all. "You think you can end something that has existed for centuries? You are but pawns in a game far beyond your understanding." The ground shifted, turning into a maze of twisting paths and towering walls as the group approached the towers. The air was growing colder, and the whispers had returned, louder and more insistent. "Stay close," Emily shouted, leading the way. The maze was alive, its walls shifting and changing with movement. Shadows darted out every corner, their faceless forms just out of reach, yet always present. Moving in a cautious manner, they breathed in the frosty air. At one turn, Jack screamed at the hand that shot from the wall, grabbing onto his arm. Mark hastily swiveled his flashlight in the direction of this shadowy limb. "They're getting bolder," Mark said, his voice tight with fear. They know we're close, Emily replied. After what felt like hours, they reached the center of the maze. There, on a raised platform, stood an altar carved from black stone. A large open book rested on its surface, its pages filled with the same glowing symbols as the fragment Emily held. "This is it," she said, stepping toward the altar. The ground trembled, and the crimson mask appeared above the altar, floating ominously. The woman in the red robes emerged from the shadows, her mask glowing brighter than ever. "You cannot take what is not yours," she said, her voice a thunderous roar. "We're not leaving without it," Emily replied, her voice steady despite the fear in her chest. The woman raised her hand, and the shadows surged forward. The group fought desperately, using whatever they could to fend off the shadows. Jack swung his flashlight like a weapon. Mark used a broken piece of wood. Sophia clung to Emily, her eyes wide with terror. Emily stretched out for the book on the altar, but as her fingers closed around it, the red mask shot forward, glowing with an otherworldly light. She screamed as it latched onto her face, overwhelming her. "Emily!" Sophia yelled, grabbing at her arm. Emily writhed in pain, but she would not let go of the book. With one final spurt of strength, she ripped off the mask, and with a heave, cast it to the floor, where it broke apart with the sound of glass crashing. The woman in red shrieked, and her form started to disintegrate, fading in the shadows as the labyrinth collapsed. The group took the book and ran, the walls of the maze crumbling behind them. They plunged back through the mirror as the crimson realm imploded, the red light dissipating into darkness. They landed back in the library, bruised and battered but alive. The house was silent, its oppressive presence gone. Emily held the book tightly, her hands shaking. "It's not over," she said. "This is only the beginning." The air in the house had shifted. The oppressive weight was gone, but a hollow stillness lingered, as though the house itself was holding its breath. Emily, Mark, Sophia, and Jack stood in the library, exhausted and bruised, their clothes torn and smeared with crimson dust from the realm they had escaped. Emily hugged the ancient book to her chest. The symbols pulsing from it seemed to throb like a heartbeat. She could feel its power echoing within her, equal parts hope and dread. "We did it," Jack whispered, leaning against a broken bookshelf. "We destroyed the mask." Sophia shook her head, her eyes darting around the room. "No, it doesn't feel over. Not yet." Emily nodded. "The mask may be gone, but the curse isn't broken. This book, it's the key, but we need to finish what we started." Mark stared at her, his face pale and drawn. "And how do we do that?" Emily opened the book, its pages filled with symbols that writhed and shifted in the dim light as she read. She pointed to an illustration of a red flame surrounded by dark tendrils. "The ritual, it's incomplete. That's why the curse lingers." Sophia leaned in closer, reading the page. "What kind of ritual?" A hesitation in her voice dropped it to a whisper. "A cleansing ritual, but it requires a sacrifice." The group gathered around the book, the pale light of the symbols lighting up their faces. Emily described the ritual, her voice level with a terror gnawing inside. "We must perform the ritual at the heart of the curse, where it all started," she said. "That would be the basement," Jack said, frowning. Emily nodded. "There's a circle carved into the floor, remember? That's the altar. We need to use it to sever the curse's hold on this house." Mark rubbed his temples, his exhaustion evident in his posture. "And the sacrifice." Emily avoided his gaze. "The book isn't clear, but it mentions blood and fire. We'll figure it out when we get there." Sophia looked at her, her voice shaking. "What if the sacrifice is one of us?" The room fell silent. "We'll cross that bridge when we come to it," Emily said finally, closing the book. "But if we don't do this, the curse will consume us all." It felt like walking into the mouth of a beast as they made their way down to the basement. The house was silent, but it seemed to be watching them, its walls groaning softly as in protest. Shadows flickered at the edges of their vision, and cold drafts whispered through the hallways. When they finally arrived at the basement door, Emily hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob. She could feel the darkness beyond it, waiting. "Do you know this?" Jack asked, gripping his flashlight tightly. Emily nodded. "We don't have a choice." She pushed the door open, and the group descended into the abyss. The basement was exactly as they remembered, cold, damp, and filled with an unnatural darkness. The circle carved into the stone floor seemed to glow faintly, its edges marked with the same symbols as the book. Emily stepped forward and put the book in the middle of the circle. She turned to the group, a grim expression on her face. "Once we begin, there's no turning back." Emily began to read from the book, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. The symbols on the circle lit up, their glow spreading across the room like veins of fire. The air thickened up with an unseeable pulse. Shadows coalesced across the edges of the space. They grew and bent. Sophia clung onto Mark's arm with desperation, her eyes so full of terror. "They're coming!" "Keep them back," Emily barked, keeping her aim straight at the book. Jack and Mark grabbed whatever they could find to fight off the shadows. Pipes, wooden planks, even rocks. The shadows hissed and recoiled as the men swung their makeshift weapons, but they didn't retreat. Sophia stood frozen, her eyes fixed on the circle. She could see something forming in the center, a shape emerging from the glowing symbols. "It's her," she whispered. The woman in the crimson mask seemed to take a more solid shape. Though broken, the mask seemed to remake itself upon her face, its cracks glowing with some otherworldly light. "You can't stop it," she said, speaking in a voice that sent shudders throughout the room. "The curse is infinite." Emily's voice went hoarse as the woman approached, a presence overwhelming. "We have to complete the ritual," she screamed, trying to drive herself on and continue reading. The book's symbols glowed brighter, and the circle began to emit a crimson flame. The woman screamed, her form flickering like a dying flame, but the shadows grew stronger, surging toward the group. One of them grabbed Jack, pulling him into the darkness. "Jack!" Mark shouted, lunging after him, but it was too late. Sophia fell to her knees, tears streaming down her face. "We're going to die here." "No," Emily said, her voice firm. She looked at the book, then at the glowing circle. "The sacrifice. It has to be me." Mark grabbed her arm. "No, there has to be another way." "There isn't," Emily said, pulling away. "This curse started with her, and it ends with me." She stepped into the circle before anyone could stop her. The flames rose around her, but she didn't scream. She held the book high and shouted the final words of the ritual. The room exploded with light. When the light faded, the basement was silent. The circle was gone, and so was Emily. The book lay on the ground, its symbols dark and lifeless. The other three stood there in stunned silence, letting the weight of what had happened sink in. She did it," Sophia whispered. Mark picked up the book, his hands shaking. "The curse is broken." The house groaned, its walls cracking and collapsing around them. "Let's go," Jack shouted, pulling them toward the stairs. They barely made it out before the house crumbled into rubble, leaving nothing but a scorched patch of earth. As they stood there in the cold night air, staring at the ruins, Sophia turned to Mark. "Do you think she's gone?" Mark looked at the book in his hands. "She's gone. But she saved us." Weeks later, Mark, Sophia, and Jack stood in a quiet cemetery, placing flowers on an unmarked grave. The book had been buried with Emily, its power sealed forever. As they turned to leave, a faint whisper carried on the wind. "Thank you. They looked at each other, a mixture of sorrow and relief in their eyes. The nightmare was over, or so they thought.